Today we have Dr. Dennis McFadden from the UT Austin Department of Psychology, and he will talk about the acoustics and psychoacoustics of the JFK assassination. Dr. McFadden was also a colleague of Lloyd Jeffress and donated many of the displays in the new Lloyd Jeffress reading room. There will be a small reception for Dr. McFadden after this talk in the reading room to show him the displays, and all are welcome. Thank you.
Greetings to you. President John F. Kennedy was shot to death in 1963 in Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. After an extensive investigation of all aspects of the assassination, the government issued a report in 1964 saying that one gunman acting alone fired 3 shots, 2 of which hit the president. Immediately, questions and doubts were raised about various aspects of that report. In order to resolve several questions about the acoustics of Dealey Plaza, the government implemented a partial reenactment of the assassination in 1978, 15 years after the assassination. One reason being to try to understand the wide disparity among witnesses as to the origin of the gunshots on that day. My goal for today is to cover the procedures and the findings of that governmental reenactment exercise. Clearly, most, probably all, of the members of this audience are far too young to have any personal recollections about the Kennedy assassination in 1963 or about the official reenactment in 1978. Also, what they might have learned about those events is likely to be spotty. So, what I'm going to do today is set the stage for the government's acoustical reenactment of the JFK assassination by discussing some relevant U.S. history. Understand that what you will hear is a highly idiosyncratic summary because I have no professional credentials in history. After some basic history, we'll talk about some simple acoustics, and finally we'll talk about some of the difficulties associated with localizing the origin of a gunshot in a complex acoustical environment. So, a mix of basic history and applied science. Before starting, I need to make another general point. Any assassination is a violent, brutal, gruesome event. One life is ended prematurely, and many other lives are permanently changed. Discussion of any assassination begs for compassion, tact, and respect. Please know that I am trying to show the respect that is due, and I want to apologize in advance if at any point the discussion seems to treat delicate details too callously, too clinically, too unemotionally. So let's get started with some of the history. Hopefully you're going to be able to see my cursor. The president was assassinated on the 22nd of November in Dealey Plaza, 22nd of November 63 in Dealey Plaza. This is arguably one of the most important murders in the history of the world, and it's surely the most thoroughly investigated murder in the history of the world. This is arguably one of the most important watershed events in U.S. history. This man was known around the world for his charisma, intelligence, and sense of humor. Also, he offered a sense of hope, of promise for the future, not just to Americans, but to people around the world. He was the first U.S. president to be born in the 20th century, and he was especially beloved by, and he especially inspired young people. In various polls, he achieved an approval rating of 83%. 1 year earlier, he negotiated the Cuban Missile Crisis, arguably the closest the world has come to a global nuclear war then or since. He and his wife were universally known as Jack and Jackie, and they were international celebrities. On the day of the assassination, telephone exchanges all across the country broke down because of all the calls made about the sad news. When JFK's casket lay in state in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol building, 250,000 mourners passed by the closed casket in 18 hours. The line stretched 9 miles. JFK's assassination and its immediate aftermath was one of the first major events leading everyday Americans to begin losing trust in their government. Other later events were the Vietnam War, the Watergate cover-up, the Iran-Contra scandal, the Chicago police riot at the Democratic National Convention, the Kent State shootings, Rachel Carson's revelations about the widespread effects of pesticides, the government's ignoring the links between tobacco and cancer, and so on. At the time of JFK's assassination, 76% of Americans trusted their government to, quote, to do what is right. That number now is 17%. So this was an extremely important watershed event in the history of our country and of the world. Accordingly, it was important to document the crime as thoroughly as we possibly could. Some background. This was a political trip of the Kennedys to Texas. The next national election was in '64, a year off, and Texas was critically important for that re-election. The Texas Democratic Party was in disarray. There was a liberal branch run by the U.S. Senator Ralph Yarborough and a conservative branch run by the governor of the state, John Connally, who was a protege of Lyndon Johnson, who was now the vice president. So the Kennedys visited San Antonio and Houston the day before, then spent the night in Fort Worth. On the day of the assassination, the president spoke to a breakfast meeting. Then the whole group flew over to Love Field. It's a very short hop, of course, but the publicist wanted it because it's very dramatic to have the president and the first lady coming down the stairs from an airplane and everything. So, it was a political event, and that's why they flew to cover 30 miles. There was a motorcade scheduled, and it was supposed to go from the airport, Love Field, through downtown Dallas, over to the Dallas Trade Mart, where there was going to be a lunch with a bunch of local gurus. Then they were going to fly to Austin, where there was a fundraising dinner all planned for a municipal auditorium. That doesn't exist anymore. It's where Long Center now is. And then they were going to go off and stay at the vice president's ranch in Johnson City for the weekend. The route of the motorcade was published in both Dallas newspapers on Tuesday, 4 days before the event itself, and it was never changed, contrary to some conspiracy theorists that will tell you that the route was changed so that Oswald could do the shooting. The assassination occurred right at about 12:30 p.m. By 1 p.m., the president was pronounced dead at Parkland Hospital. The body was put in a casket and loaded onto Air Force One for a trip back to Dallas, to D.C. about 2 p.m. No autopsy was done in Texas, contrary to Texas law. The Secret Service just bullied their way through the local authorities, pushed the casket, and put it on the plane and escaped. The governor of the state, John Connally, and his wife were sitting in jump seats right in front of the Kennedys in the open limousine. And the governor was injured, had multiple surgeries over the course of time. As far as I know, he did return to a reasonably normal life eventually. Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, was in a vehicle 2 back from the president. No shots were taken at any vehicle other than the president's or at anybody else beside the president. Lyndon Johnson was sequestered by Secret Service immediately, hustled off to back rooms of the Parkland Hospital where he could be protected. At the time, there was enormous ignorance about what had happened and what was afoot. There might be some general revolution or something with multiple shooters after multiple people, whatever, and so they were doing what they could to protect him. He was sworn in as the 36th president. just before Air Force One took off for DC with the president's body. The departure was a couple of hours. The country was without a president for about 2 hours, basically. Within a week of getting back to DC, Lyndon Johnson appointed a committee, a blue ribbon committee, to investigate all aspects of the assassination. And they worked hard for 10 months or so and generated a report known as the Warren Report. A little more information about the motorcade. The presidential limousine led the parade, of course, the president and his wife in the back seat, the governor and his wife immediately in front of them in jump seats, and then some Secret Service agents in the front seat, a car with Secret Service agents following behind, the car with Lyndon Johnson following that one. In that car was Senator Ralph Yarborough. The president had insisted on this. He wanted to make it look like there was unity in the Texas Democratic Party by having Johnson and Yarborough in the same car. I doubt that they spoke. Then there were a number of other vehicles in this motorcade, and scattered throughout the motorcade were motorcycles of Dallas Police Department officers. Here's a plan view of the Dealey Plaza. The downtown Dallas is way off to the right of the screen. Can you see my cursor here? This is Main Street, and the motorcade came down Main Street, made a right turn onto Houston, ran about a block or so, made a sharp left turn down Elm Street, and eventually exited this general area known as Dealey Plaza under the triple underpass. Up here at the corner of Houston and Elm is the Texas School Book Depository building. My understanding is that this was a private company. Their job was to distribute textbooks to various independent school districts around the country. Oswald had worked there for about a month, and his job was reasonably menial. He would just take orders and go and get 100 of these and 10 of those and something, and wrap them up and get them prepared for shipping out to whatever a school district asked for them. On the northwest side of Elm Street here is a grassy area. This, in plan view, you can't see this, but there's a considerable amount of elevation loss. As you go from this corner, Elm and Houston, down Elm Street toward the triple underpass, there's a reasonable loss of altitude. And so the low points are here in the center of this grassy area, and the road itself. Above the road then, above the level of the roadbed, is this mound that came to be called the grassy knoll. It is all grassy, and it's higher elevation. And there's a structure there called a pergola. I'll show you in a minute what that looks like a little better. It's an open-air structure with some columns in it and whatever. It's a place to sit quiet and contemplate this plaza. I can't imagine the plaza was ever really quiet and pleasant to contemplate because it's a major traffic intersection, but that's the structure. But there was a fence, there still is a fence that separates this grassy general area from the railroad yards that are behind. This triple underpass was not for cars, it was a railroad overpass here. Here's another view. I don't know how well that's going to show up at the back. This building, it's the same layout. Here's Main Street, Houston Street, and Elm Street. This is the Texas School Book Depository building. This window right here on the 6th floor is where Oswald, the assassin, was located and where he took his shots from. Oops, I lost my cursor. Right there. Here's the pergola. You can see a little better. There's some pillars, and there's a little roof on this one. There's some others here that are in the same theme with pillars and little places to sit in front and whatever. There's some stairs in front of the pergola, and then there's this concrete rise. There's this concrete structure right to the side. That's where Abraham Zapruder was standing. Zapruder was a dressmaker. He had a business over here in this building right across the street. He's an amateur photographer. He brought his 8mm camera that day, and he stood at this location and filmed the motorcade as it came around the corner and eventually disappeared out through the triple underpass. And he has one of the best recordings of the events of that day because of that. These are the members of the Warren Commission. This will be on the test. They were characterized as a bipartisan blue ribbon panel. They were a hard-working group. This is not a group that let their staff, which was pretty considerable staff, they had basically an unlimited budget. They had a good staff, but they did a lot of the work themselves. They did a lot of the interviewing themselves. They traveled to Dallas more than once, etc. About 10 months after the assassination, this committee was able to issue its report. It came to be called the Warren Report. Their conclusions included the following. There was one shooter. It was Lee Harvey Oswald. He shot from that corner window on the 6th floor Depository building. He was working on his own. He took 3 shots. 2 of them hit the president, 1 missed. The Warren Commission was a little unclear as to the order of those shots, but a lot of additional evidence from later says it's the first shot that missed, which is kind of peculiar if you think about it, and we'll come back to that point. Another one of the major findings from the Warren Commission was the so-called single bullet theory, that the second shot that hit the president in the back and exited in front of his throat is the same bullet that then struck Connolly and produced multiple injuries, eventually exited. That bullet was found on a gurney in Parkland Hospital that Connolly had been laid on to get him out of the limousine. The shots did come from a Mannlicher Carcano rifle that was found on the 6th floor. It wasn't even very well hidden. And the Warren Committee praised the Zapruder film for the value it contributed to making sense of the events of the day. Even before the Warren Committee was finished, there were complaints and sniping and criticism. Once the report emerged, this just intensified. There were various groups that took exception to various details of the report. Some people objected strongly to this single bullet idea. Unfortunately, there was a photograph reproduced in the Warren report of this bullet that was found in Parkland Hospital, and from the perspective in that particular photo, it looks pretty pristine. But just immediately next to it is a photo from the other side, and it shows this is a very battered bullet. This is nothing like pristine, and there's no reason to build an entire conspiracy around the fact that that bullet couldn't have injured both parties. The president's head takes a backward movement at the time of the final shot, and a lot of people argue that that has to mean that there was a shot from the front. It couldn't possibly be a shot from the rear that would do that. Some objected to Oswald's marksmanship. Could he possibly have pulled this off? There were a large number of criticisms and whatever. My belief is that a major factor contributing to all of the criticisms of the Warren report and contributing to the rise of conspiracy theories is how unbelievable it was, and still is, that Oswald could have committed this act without any help. He's a 24-year-old nobody, a misfit, a high school dropout, a habitual liar, an arrogant egotist with no accomplishments to warrant either, and he's acting more or less spontaneously. Yet in 11 seconds, he changed the course of history. People just found that to be extremely hard to understand and to accept. Also hard to believe was that another nobody, Jack Ruby, owner of sleazy strip clubs and living on the fringes of the Dallas underworld, was able to shoot and kill Oswald 2 days after the JFK assassination. And this, while Oswald was being escorted through the basement of the Dallas Police Department under guard by at least 70 officers of the Dallas Police Department. How could all of this possibly happen unless there was some grand plan, some grand conspiracy planned by some entity having wide knowledge, wide power, wide connections? The answer, of course, is that everyday life is chock full of unlikely, low probability events. But apparently, human minds just cannot accept that explanation when the event to be explained is so earth-shaking. And instead, we become willing to accept conspiracy explanations that authors and other pundits offer. Human patterns of thinking and reasoning are both the remarkable products of eons of evolutionary history and the hostage of that same history. About 5 years after the Kennedy assassination, Martin Luther King was shot in Memphis, Tennessee. The FBI ran that investigation, and there were a lot of objections raised to the story that the FBI told. The person that was accused as the assassin, James Earl Ray, was an escapee from a Missouri prison at the time. He had no obvious source of resources or whatever, yet he managed to escape from Memphis, get to Atlanta, get to Canada, get to Europe, wander around Portugal and Spain and whatever, and come back to the UK before he got caught. And many people found this all quite unbelievable unless he had some help. So there was widespread disbelief about both the Kennedy and the Martin Luther King assassinations. And the US House of Representatives decided to appoint a so-called select committee on assassinations in order to investigate these two assassinations a little better and try to calm down some of the conspiracy theories that were all afoot. The basic idea was that, initially at least, was that this select committee would be responsible for re-examining existing evidence that had been accumulated already about the two assassinations. But at least in the case of the Kennedy assassination, that changed early on because some additional evidence emerged. And the additional evidence that emerged was that the Dallas Police Department had been recording all of the police voice traffic on the day of the assassination. I used to think that there was some hanky-panky involved in all this, that the Dallas police had somehow kept these recordings from the Warren Commission or something, and I now realize that that's just not true. The Warren Commission surely knew about these recordings. They just didn't think there was anything in them that would be relevant, and they didn't take them and they didn't analyze them. And you've got to remember it's 1964, what techniques were available to analyze recordings anyway. There were two devices working that day, two different brands of product. One is a so-called Dictabel Recorder. It was on what the police called their Channel 1. Actually, this recorder ran all the time, every day, all the time, just recording everything. It's this very low fidelity device, but it gave them some record of the voice traffic that occurred on any given day. Well, it just so happens that on the day of the assassination, one of the motorcycles that was using this Channel 1 had a stuck microphone. So on the motorcycle, there's this kind of large lighted push button, and motorcyclists are wearing these big heavy gloves, and when they wanted to say something, to broadcast something, they'd mash down on this big button and talk and then let go. Well, somehow, when the officer let go, the button didn't go fully retract. It hung up on the little metal around the side, and so it was on. So what Dictabel recording Channel 1 had was 5.5 minutes of recording on the day of the assassination. A preliminary look at what was on that recording suggested there very well might be some gunshots recorded here. This might be worth further investigation. You got to realize it's a low fidelity device, a very, very noisy environment. The microphone on the motorcycle is only about a foot from the motor of the motorcycle. It's a very noisy environment. The other device is a gray audiograph. It was used only on days when there were special events. So certain police officers would be using only channel 2, and their voices were recorded on this other audiograph. This is what they look like. This is the Dictabel. Over here on this side is the, can you see my cursor? Thank you. This is the medium that was used. It's about 3.5 inches from here to here, and it's about 12 inches around. It's characterized as a vinyl or acetate material, and there was a stylus that made a groove in the around this acetate recording to record the sounds. This is an audiograph. It's basically the same idea. Their recording medium was circular, also described as a kind of a vinyl acetate material. Also had a stylus that made grooves around it and thereby recorded the sound. These are devices that are very low fidelity. They existed for office purposes primarily, dictation. So imagine you've got an MD who's looking at some X-rays, and he's reading off what he sees. He speaks it into the dictograph or the audiogram, and then that later is given to the secretary to produce hard copy of his report. That's how things are done then. What happened was the House Committee on Assassinations was made aware of the existence of these recordings, and they got interested, and they went to an internationally famous acoustics consulting firm, Newman in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The physical acousticians there did some preliminary looking at what was on these recordings and thought, you know, some of this series of impulses, or maybe this series of impulses, those could be gunshots. This could have been a motorcycle that was in the motorcade in Dealey Plaza at the time of the assassination, and it might have gotten recorded. But there's an enormous amount of uncertainty because nobody knew anything about the acoustics of Dealey Plaza. The result was viewed as sufficiently interesting to warrant the implementation of a partial reenactment of the Kennedy assassination in Dealey Plaza. So, early one Sunday morning in August of '78, the streets around Dealey Plaza were closed to vehicular and foot traffic. Arrays of microphones were placed around the plaza. They had 10 channels of recording at the time. It's all analog, of course. 10 channels of recording, 12 channels of recording at the time, and 3 different placements were used. And for each one of those placements, gunshots were taken from either the depository window or from the grassy knoll. They shot at different targets in different locations along Elm Street. In the process, then the physical acousticians were able to get nice, clean recordings off of a whole array of different microphones located in different places around the plaza. There's no way you're going to be able to see what's on this thing, but let me just tell you. This, we've already seen the plan view. This is Main Street, here is Houston, there is Elm. These dots are the microphones, the individual microphones, and there were 12 of them. This is the first placement, this set from here down to here. That was one placement. Then we moved the microphones here and did another series of shots. And then finally we moved the microphones to here and did another series of shots. This was judged to be necessary because you realize that the motorcycle wouldn't have been stationary if it had been part of the motorcade. It would have been moving, and so you couldn't expect to match impulses acquired by the microphone on the motorcycle from one particular location. You would have to do some integration over a couple of different. That's what was done. There were different kinds of shots taken. A rifle was shot from the 6th floor window of the depository with the muzzle inside the plane of the window, with the muzzle outside the plane of the window. This was a way of trying to get a feel for how muzzle blast was affected by that manipulation. Rifles shots also came from behind the fence on the dole, and here are the targets at which those shots were taken, and one of the shots in the sequence was in fact a pistol from the knoll, just for comparison purposes. What we had here was some absolutely excellent applied science. Some knowledgeable, competent, well-equipped physical acousticians went into Dealey Plaza and did a nice compulsive reenactment of the situation as best they could. They then took the recordings that they had and went back to the recordings from the Dallas, the Dictabel from the Dallas Police Department, and made comparisons and did some careful statistical analyses, and they concluded that there were, in fact, 4 gunshots taken. This is important because there was no way that there was absolutely no evidence that Oswald took more than 3 shots. There were 3 cartridges found on the floor up there. People routinely said there were 3 shots. There was a lot of evidence, physical evidence, that only 3 shots had been made. So this conclusion that there were 4 shots taken was very important. It clearly implies a conspiracy. Oswald couldn't have shot 4 times. There had to be another shooter, and maybe he was on the knoll and shot from the front, and that would explain the backward head movement. Before you get too wrapped up in all of this, it's wrong. The exercise was doomed from the outset because the impulses that the physical acousticians were looking at on the Dictabel were from the wrong point in real time. They had been careful about trying to figure out where, and so this thing is free running, right? It's 5.5 minutes of continuous recording off this one channel, but you don't know when in time it was, and you do various things like listen to some of the utterances and whatever, try to figure out the timing, and they decided that the timing was about right for the assassination, and that proved to be wrong. The way it was proved to be wrong was some assassination buff who sounds like he had nothing much else in life to do but assassinate, acquired copies of the recordings, both Channel 1 and Channel 2. The way he got those is that after the Select Committee finished their report, they made the recordings publicly available, and a few popular magazines published them. They put out on like a cardboard sheet a round disc, 45 RPM disc. This person, Mr. Barber, bought the disc and listened, bought them and listened to them endlessly over the course of 4 months. Dozens, probably hundreds of hours of listening. In the process, he detected the presence of the same utterances on both channels, Channel 1 and Channel 2. Well, how could that be? The simple answer is crosstalk. If the motorcycle with the stuck transmit key were close to or adjacent to a motorcycle tuned to channel 2, then anything broadcast on channel 2 would get picked up on the microphone that was stuck and recorded on channel 1. And of course, once you realize that that's what you got, you can perfectly temporally align those two recordings, which wasn't possible before. And once you perfectly align them, you realize that the impulses that both Brannick and Newman had analyzed were at least a minute after the assassination itself. Furthermore, additional evidence came out that suggests that the motorcycle with the stuck microphone was probably not in Dealey Plaza, but somewhere else in the city anywhere. So the whole thing blew up within a couple of months of this report. That is, there is no acoustical evidence for gunshots, no evidence for any kind of conspiracy. Why are we here? Well, in addition to the physical acoustics team, there also, at the time of the reenactment, was a psychoacoustics team on site. The idea was that the House Senate Committee wanted to learn more about human sound localization in Dealey Plaza. The idea was we would put expert listeners at different places around the plaza during the shot sequence and have them report their perceptual experiences. In the process, we would have them make a two alternative forced choice decision about whether the shot they heard came from the grassy knoll or from the depository. You saw that they were intermixed in that sequence, I should. Professor?
Okay, you mentioned that the BBN physical acoustics people found a section of the tape which indicated that there were 4 shots. Was the actual section of the tape found which showed 3 shots?
No, this motorcycle almost surely wasn't in that Dealey Plaza. It was somewhere else. Almost surely. It was only after the fact that the various motorcyclists were themselves allowed to hear the tapes, and the motorcyclists that were closest to the presidential limousine said, 1, we're supposed to be tuned to channel 2. I was tuned to channel 2, not 1. 2, as soon as everything started happening, we accelerated like hell. And you would have heard my engine rev up, and it didn't rev up. And again, just a whole series of unfortunate things that kept the physical acousticians from the kind of information that would have helped them avoid what happened to them. So the idea was to position expert listeners around the plaza and get them to make some decisions and tell us what they heard, and maybe we can learn something. At the time of the assassination, there were something like 700 people in Dealey Plaza. Over the weeks and months after the assassination, a number of attempts were made to interview people in the plaza and get their impressions about various things. At least a couple of these attempts included questions about what they heard. And so there were a number of compilations of these data performed. Here's one that was done by an author named Josiah Thompson down here in the corner, who published a very influential book, 6 Seconds in Dallas. It was published about 4 years after the assassination. For a time, it was very influential, very widely read, etc. And these are data from his book. These are very unorthodox. They look like histograms, but they're pretty unorthodox. Let me just summarize for you this one. Here's the number of shots. Depending upon what you use for the denominator, anywhere from 72 to 79% of the people that were interviewed, 190 people, reported 3 shots. There's darn good agreement here, 70% and more depending on how you calculate the data. These other figures about the spacing and the time span of the shots and whatever show much less unanimity. The panel of greatest interest to us is this one about the direction of the sound. Where did the gunshots originate from? So I want to walk you through this kind of unorthodox figure. This first bar is the total N. 190 people were interviewed for this question. Of them, 64% gave an answer. I'm sorry, 63%. It's up here. 33% gave an answer. That is to say, something like 2/3 of the people in this compilation didn't have enough certainty about the source of the gunshot to make a decision. They just abdicated on this question. Of those that did answer, about an equal number said the shot came from the knoll or the shots came from the school book depository. These ear witness data beg for an explanation. It would be nice if we could understand this set of responses better. I'm going to try and do that for you by appealing to both psychoacoustics and physical acoustics. So first I'm going to tell you something about sound localization that you may already know. Humans are darn good at it. We're very good at localizing sound sources in three-dimensional space. The way we do it is we use two different cues. One of them is called interaural differences of time. And this stems from the fact that if there is a sound that's off to the side of your head, the acoustical path to the nearer ear is shorter than the acoustical path to the farther ear. Duh. But you wouldn't think that that would matter very much because it seems like such a small distance difference, right? If you put the sound source at 90 degrees facing your ear, that's going to be the largest difference in time of arrival at the two ears. And that corresponds for most human heads to the ballpark of 800 microseconds, 0.8 of a millisecond. Again, you're going to say, that's way too small for humans to be able to use. Lord Rayleigh thought it was too small. He dismissed it completely. In fact, you're much better than that. You can determine two different sources of sound that differ only by 5 to 10 microseconds. You're extraordinarily accurate. The other cue that humans use to localize sound sources in space is the interaural difference in sound pressure level. Again, put the sound over at 90 degrees. If the sound, in order to reach the further ear, has to go through the head shadow that the head is throwing. This is obviously a frequency-dependent cue. It's going to be stronger at higher frequencies. The bigger the head is relative to the wavelengths of the sound, you're going to get a deeper and deeper shadow. It can be pretty deep. You can get 30, 35 dB of difference between the two ears for a high-frequency sound source that's at 90 degrees. But again, you don't need that. Something like 1/2 to 1 dB is all you need to tell the difference between two sound sources that are close together in three-dimensional space. We're just extraordinarily good at using these two cues for sound localization. Now let's talk about acoustics a bit. Bullets from rifles are supersonic. They're traveling faster than the speed of sound. What that means is there are two sources of sound associated with a rifle shot. There's the muzzle blast. This is the noise associated with the explosion that goes on inside the gun and the escape of the bullet from the muzzle of the gun. And this is sound that you're familiar with. It propagates spherically, falls off at 6 dB for each doubling of distance, propagates at the speed of sound in air, of course. And for us, it's important to note that this is an accurate source of information about the location of the rifle, of the source. If the person out there in Dealey Plaza somewhere had just the muzzle blast, it ought to be pretty easy to localize where it came from. There are some problems with like reflections and other things, but still, the muzzle blast is itself quite an accurate source of information about the origin of the sound source in three-dimensional space. Then there's the shock wave. The bullet is traveling at faster than the speed of sound, not uncommonly twice the speed of sound. What that means is that for a listener, an observer, somewhere moderately distant from the source, from the Texas Depository, there's going to be two sounds striking her head. One's going to be the snap of the shock wave, followed by the muzzle blast that's getting there at the speed of sound. And we note that the sound that's emanating from the bullet, the sound that's emanating from the succession of shock waves as the bullet traverses its way through the air, is not accurate information about the original source of the bullet. That is information about the source of the bullet path, not the bullet's origin. So, just to have a diagram of what we just said, here's the rifle shooting a bullet this way. At moment one, the bullet has gotten to position one, and the shock wave is lagging back. It's here. So, anybody in this general vicinity is going to hear the sound generated by the shock wave before she hears the sound from the muzzle blast. Here's a moment later, the bullet has gotten a little bit further, but so is the shock wave, but the difference in this distance is getting larger, and you get the idea. So if we were recording somewhere out there in the middle of Dealey Plaza somewhere, we would record a shock wave, and then we would get a muzzle blast, and the time elapsed here would depend upon how far away the microphone is when recording this. The further away, the longer the lag between these two. Now back to psychoacoustics. The part of the human brain that's concerned with localizing sound sources in space has a kind of an interesting characteristic. It's known as the precedence effect. What this means is that the first arriving wavefront is given extra weight when you're trying to make a decision about the location of a source. That first arriving wavefront is what you use primarily. A subsequent arriving wavefront is downplayed. It's not totally ignored, but can't be. But it's not used as much as the first arriving wavefront. This makes good sense from an evolutionary point of view. Think about any kind of a reverberant situation, an auditorium of some sort. You're listening to a particular instrument up there, and the first arriving wavefront is directly to you through the air, and then at microseconds or milliseconds later, your head is hit by other versions of that same sound that are reflected off various hard surfaces in the vicinity. Note that those reflections are not good sources of information about the location of the sound. If you were to use your sound localizing mechanisms on that second wavefront that's coming off of the wall, you would say the source is right over there. You'd be pointing at the point of reflection, not at the source. So the fact that the nervous system does this, emphasizes that first arriving wavefront, makes good sense. But what it means for us now that we've talked about the acoustics of supersonic missiles, means that the subjects are going to be drawn to using that initial snap to localize the sound source. And the following muzzle blast will be downgraded. How much it's downgraded surely depends upon how long the time between those two, how far, how distant the observer is from their rifle shot. Let's just get a little quantitative with this. Any number of reconstructions of the assassination suggest that the first shot to hit the president in the back occurred when the limousine was right at about 240 feet from the depository window. So let's use that number of 240 feet. Not terrible. Well, we note the effect on sound pressure level. This figure claims that the peak SPL of the muzzle blast at 30 feet is about 137. This is a Mannlicher, which means that at 240 feet, that's 3 doublings. We're going to be down 18 dB, so the sound is going to be 119 at that distance. For this audience, that's kind of a degenerate point. It's still damn loud, but it's down some from what it was closer in. That's not the question. The real question is this time between the two. So let's just do a little rate times time equals distance calculations. Let's talk about the muzzle blast first. The rate is speed of sound, ballpark of 1,125 feet per second. We're fixing the distance at 240, and we're asking what's the elapsed time for that, and the answer is the ballpark of 200 milliseconds. What about the shock wave? I looked it up. A Mannlicher, the exit velocity of a bullet from a Mannlicher is about 2,300 feet per second. Fix that same distance, and we have like 100 milliseconds for the propagation time. So we've got a difference here of about 100 milliseconds at 240 feet. It's going to be greater and smaller as you vary that number. So what? Well, to put it into perspective, if an architectural acoustician were to build an auditorium in which there were strong reflections that came in 30 milliseconds after the initial air-directed waveform, it would not be viewed as an acceptable room. It may not be actually heard as an echo, but it would be a hollow sound. It would not be. That is to say, 30 milliseconds is plenty for you to be aware of the difference in the timing between two wavefronts. Here we've got 100 milliseconds, so it's a relevant factor. People that were using the precedence mechanism to localize the sound would be localizing on the path of the bullet, not on the bullet. There are other factors, of course. When you get into a real-world situation like this, there's going to be reflections in a real-world situation off the adjacent buildings, off the ground, etc. This audience is well aware of that. There's another fact about sound localization that needs to be brought up if we're going to try to account for these ear witness judgments that we saw early on. Note that the interaural time difference cue is inherently ambiguous. The difference in path length between the nearer and the farther ear for a sound source out here is exactly the same as the difference in path length for a sound right behind you over here, also from up there, also from down there. There's a number of locations in three-dimensional space that can give rise to the same value of interaural time difference. In everyday life, this typically doesn't bother us. There's enough information, visual and other information that we have when we bring to the situation, so we don't make a lot of front-back errors in everyday life. But you get into the lab, and it's not at all uncommon. In fact, in various lab experiments on sound localization, a front-back error is not even counted as an error. If the sound is at 45 degrees and the subject says 135 degrees, that's judged as the correct decision. If it's at 45 and he says 60 or he says 25 or something, that's an error. But if he picks a place, a location that has exactly the same geometry as the one you're using, in many experiments, that isn't even counted as an error. So what? Well, let's just think about what's going on in the Dealey Plaza situation. there is this snap associated with shock wave, and then later, depending upon the distance, how much later, is determined by the distance, there's a snap that's associated with the path of the bullet, not the origin of the bullet, and there's a strong temptation because of precedence effect for listeners to use that information and to localize the source on the path. But these are humans, they're intelligent. They're gonna solve the problem and get impossible answers. They're gonna have a sound source that's somewhere up in space somewhere, because the shot's coming from overhead, right? So the path of the bullet is overhead, and if they were to localize on that, depending on where they're standing in the earth, they could get some very bizarre attributions to where the sound came from. And it wouldn't be a great surprise that in some cases, when they get that information and they realize that the sound isn't coming from there, they make a front-back reversal and just attribute the sound to coming from the rear, having the same geometry. That would account for some people standing along Elm Street, attributing the sound to the grassy knoll behind them, because the other alternative is preposterous. The sound couldn't be up there if they were localizing on the snap, not on the boom. So what I've been trying to argue for the last few slides is when you take into account the two-source aspect of a supersonic projectile, the reflections that exist in any real-world environment, including Dealey Plaza, the precedence effect and front-back reversal characteristics of the human binaural localization mechanism, the data that you see here, these ear witness data, come to make more sense. The fact that a large number of people were unable to make a decision makes sense when they were getting these crazy impressions from their own auditory systems. People who were by and large not experienced at localizing gunshots, whatever, it was a new experience for them. And no great surprise that they would be confused and not be able to answer the question. In addition to that kind of academic kind of analysis of the ear witness data, we have data from allegedly expert listeners who were in Dealey Plaza on the day. Remember that there were these multiple placements of the microphones, and these things indicate, these brown circles indicate where the observers stood at different times in the sequence. And we had the sequence that you know about, shots from the depository and shots from the knoll. So here is a table of the results for those two observers. Here's sequence 1, sequence 2, sequence 3. You can see the denominators here differ some. That sequence of shots that I showed you was just kind of like a guideline. They sometimes, for God knows what reasons, the physical acousticians would want another shot of one sort or another. So that was a guideline. And you can see that our performance was really quite good. We're between 80 and 90% correct. Now these are data that are averaged over different locations. We were standing in different places in the plaza for different parts of these different sequences. And you see that we, at least, I don't think we're particularly sophisticated listeners in a situation like this, but we were easily able to discriminate between the two locations, the knoll and the book depository. Now, of course, our task was different from the ear witnesses that were in the plaza on the day. We didn't have any uncertainty about the location of the rifles. We knew that they were either on the knoll or in the book depository. We didn't know exactly when each shot was going to take place, but we knew generally another shot was coming, and people in the plaza wouldn't have had that. They would have been more surprised. And nominally, we're a little bit more sophisticated observers than the average person in the plaza. So you have to take these data into account. You have to take these factors into account when you're looking at these data. From my point of view, one of the most important outcomes from the psychoacoustics team was the thing at the bottom. I believe it was absolutely, very highly unlikely that a rifle shot came from the knoll. Those shots in the sequence that we listened to were just unambiguous, and depending upon where you were standing, could be just absolutely overwhelming. My belief is that had there been a rifle shot from the knoll, Zapruder would have been knocked sideways on his concrete abutment. He just would have been so overwhelmingly loud a sound. He would have taken a step to the side. Well, I realize that you've been garden pathed here. I took you down this long trail about these recordings and the analysis and all that, and it all turned out for naught. The physical acousticians were unfortunately wrong in their conclusion about the 4 shots and the conspiracy. You've got to feel really sorry for these guys. They just were working on a bad premise. They did some excellent applied science in the field. They just had a bad assumption, a bad premise. It's unfortunate because it gave not just physical acoustics a black eye, but science in general. It was fun for the conspiracy theorists to jump all over the pointy-headed scientists who couldn't even align the tapes in time in order to make their analyses. And I think it's truly, truly unfortunate that there still exists an official U.S. government report saying there were 4 shots. You can't take it back, it's out there. On the other hand, I kind of think the psychoacoustics team did kind of a nice job. I thought we explained the ear witness data pretty well, and when we are actually performed in the reenactment situation, I thought we discriminated pretty well between the shots. Because I've garden pathed you through this entire talk, I feel a bit guilty about it, so I thought I'd at least leave you with some positive stuff. I've been involved with this assassination story on and off over the years. And these are the personal opinions I've acquired over that time. I believe that the Warren report got it basically right. There was one shooter, Lee Harvey Oswald, shooting from that corner window in the Depository building, and I think he was working on his own. I think this was a more or less spontaneous act. He took 3 shots, he missed, he hit twice and missed once. I think it was the first one that missed. I believe in the second, the single bullet theory. In fact, it's hard to imagine anything else once you really look at the data that exists. I think one bullet both wounded the president and wounded John Connally. I don't think there's any evidence of a conspiracy between Oswald and the Mafia and Oswald and Cuba, Oswald and Ruby, or Ruby and Cuba, or any other combination. There just isn't any good evidence. The final 2 things on the slide here are in parentheses because they're relatively recent for me. I've been away from the assassination story and literature for a number of years before beginning to prepare this talk. And in the process, I discovered an analysis done by a guy named Holland that was published in a magazine that I don't think exists anymore, Newsweek, in 2014. And his basic explanation is twofold. One is he believes that contrary to what the Warren Commission was guessing at, Zapruder really didn't catch the first shot on his film. He started too late. That in fact, Holland argues that the first shot came just as soon as Oswald had a good shot from the depository window, just as soon as the president's car came around and his back was to Oswald. He thinks that, he's arguing that Oswald was using the telescopic scope that he had on his rifle, and he took aim at the president And that first shot hit this steel mast that hung over the street. You can't see this very well, but there's a stoplight hung here. So this right here is a standard, and there's this arched arm out from the standard holding a three-light stoplight to control traffic along Elm Street. And the argument here is that the first shot hit the top of that steel standard and ricocheted over here. For all since the Warren Commission days, they've known that there was some kind of a little scab right here on a piece of metal, a metal grating. And then there were over here, there was a chunk of concrete knocked off of the curb. This has been known all along and just never got a very good accounting, to my knowledge, until Holland came along and put it all together. On the day of the assassination, there were 3 people wounded: the president, the governor, and a guy named James Teague standing all the way over here on the south side of Main Street. He was hit by a piece of concrete on the cheek. This piece of concrete was knocked off by a bullet. There's lead. Later analysis was able to find traces of lead at the 2 points shown as ricochet points here. So anyway, this account by Holland I found to be quite interesting, quite captivating, because it explains a number of unexplained things before. How could Oswald miss the first shot and then hit twice more at a greater distance with a moving vehicle? The car is moving very much slower here, coming around the corner. How could that be? And this explains it. But maybe I'm a victim of a conspiracy theory myself. I don't know, but I found that to be quite an interesting, for me, recent revelation. So that's it. As promised, we talked a little history and we talked a little applied science. I hope you don't feel totally victimized by the garden path approach that I took. Do remember that the psychoacousticians basically got it all right. So in psychology, we have a rule where at the end of the talk, we take 30 seconds and let those who have to go leave, and then take questions. I suspect Dr. Blackstock wants to hold my feet to the fire on something.
Very small nitpick. You said that the papers gave the route
Yeah,
4 days before,
yeah,
on a Tuesday.
yeah.
If that were correct, then the assassination occurred on a Saturday. My recollection.
Oh, no, it's Friday. Maybe Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday.
Okay.
Repeat the question, please.
Okay, but the question was,
The route of the motorcade was published on Tuesday, however many days that is before the assassination on Friday. Yes, sir.
Out of the 700 people there in Dealey Plaza, did anyone report seeing a muzzle flash?
Smokeless powder, I don't think so.
You don't see.
There's reports of cordite. I mean, a number of people smelled the after effects of gunpowder, whatever it is. Yeah.
Was the time between the first and second shot longer than the time between the second
Yes.
and third shot?
Ballpark of twice as long.
Are you aware there's a witness that's riding in the motorcade that's still alive here in Austin? I don't know if that's in value.
No. Are we looking at him?
No, he was head of the press bus that was there. And he gave a lecture on this too about 2 or 3 years ago. He's still alive.
Huh. The name?
Julian Reed.
No, I didn't know that.
When were the ear witnesses' accounts?
Different times, different times. It's not a well-controlled experiment. It's research in the real world, and different people were asked by different times. I think even by different interviewers, interrogators. But the FBI was around asking people. Reporters were around asking people. And this guy Josiah Thompson, I think that 190, he talked to all 190 of those people. Now they may have also talked to somebody else. But he's got this table, an appendix in his book, where he lists each one of the people that and what they said. And to each of the questions, there's these 4 questions, the time in between them, how many were there, etc.
So it's possible that some of those reports, though, were contaminated since
Yes,
this has probably been
very possible,
recorded.
very possible. Sure. By the time, yep. News was coming out. A lot of news was wrong. So,
For the expert witnesses, you and Dr. Reitman, how do you account for the fact that you had you had a lot of pre-existing knowledge going into this?
Sure.
It probably had some even unconscious bias towards one location or the other. Is there a way of accounting for that? You reported accurately, or almost completely accurately, the direction of the shot, understanding the shock wave and the multiplexes and all. But is there some way with your pre-existing condition?
we were sworn to be upstanding.
We know that.
No, I don't. No, I mean, you're obviously going to bring in some bias. We didn't know about the shooting sequence. We didn't know how often they would come from each of the different locations. We had some degree of ignorance, but we did know it was going to be from one of those 2 locations. We knew that. And, you can see the 4 targets, and you know which one, big burst of sand when the bullet hits. We knew a reasonable amount. What I showed you was just the 2 alternative forced choice responses. We also wrote down after each one just a whole bunch of comments about our experiences. So for example, at one point I was standing on the overpass and a couple of shots came, and it's just absolutely, I made my choice. Did it come from here? Did it come from here? But what's absolutely compelling is that this noise that's coming at you from down Main Street, it's way over here. I knew that wasn't the source, so I gave a response, but I wrote down about and then when you look at some of the responses that people, ear witnesses gave, they report some of these. There are people that say it came from the air, which is in accord with the preceding argument. They're localizing on the shockwave.
When humans are attempting to identify the source of the sound, how does head motion play into it? So there's 3 shots. If I hear one shot and then I move my head because I'm startled, and then the second shot, I get a second blast, do our brains correlate that, combine that to get a better image? Does it mess with that noise or signal? No pun intended.
In the real world, most sounds have a pretty considerable duration. You can think about them as more or less continuous sounds. And head movements are critically important to sound localization. It's almost surely why we have so few front-back reversal errors in everyday life. We get multiple looks at the stimulus. And, dogs, hunting animals do that. They're moving their head all around. They're moving their pinup around independently, trying to localize that. But what we're talking about are transients. And so the head movements you're talking about would be between successive shots. And I don't really know anything about that kind of a study. Further, I'd point out to you that each shot was different because the bullet path was longer for each shot, you know, so the path of the bullet that precedence would have you localize on is moving around. So I obviously don't have a very good answer for you. For some people, they may have been able to ignore the path of the bullet and tend more to the muzzle blast. Certainly that would be true for people that were really close because the bullet hasn't had a chance to establish itself in, you know, the first 50 feet or something from the building.
I'm saying short duration impulses are harder to localize.
Yes.
than a longer duration. Does that play a factor in
Sure.
analysis?
Yeah, no, it's obviously true. I think it pertains to this. You have too few looks. If you have a little bit of duration, you get multiple looks at them. Multiple full cycles of the wave or whatever, and you're going to do better.
So you wouldn't expect a short duration impulse to be able to be localized.
No, I mean, the very first wavefront that reaches you has a time difference. We call it the onset time difference. Each subsequent waveform or each subsequent cycle of a continuous sound also has exactly that same interaural time difference. And you get multiple looks at it, and you're better with duration. But you can still use just that first arriving interaural time difference. It's the so-called onset time difference.
Let's just have one more question, and then we're going to have a reception, and Dennis can have some more questions.
Do you know what the duration of that gun blast is, and at that duration, would a normal person be able to categorize it as a gunshot versus just a random impulse?
Well, yeah, I don't know what else would sound like a gunshot. I suppose if you're a little bit distant from some other impulse noise, I don't have a good answer for that. It's got to be the spectral characteristics that are going to determine your ability to tell the difference on it. And
So short impulse typically would be
it's very wide band, but there's more energy in the 2,500 to 4,500 cycle range. I mean, it's not a perfectly flat spectrum for these things. There is something of a peak there. I don't have a good answer, sorry. I should have talked to acousticians.
So let's thank Dennis one more time.